мною принято решение о проведении специальной военной операции.
In the early morning of February 24th, Russia launched a full-scale military assault on Ukraine, bombing its major cities. It already looks like the greatest crisis in Europe since the end of Second World War in 1945. And as I speak, 100,000 Russian troops are moving into the capital city of Kyiv.
Russia has launched a military assault on Ukraine, hitting targets across the country.
After weeks of warnings, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has begun.
President Putin of Russia has unleashed war.
American citizens should leave now.
I know there are more serious concerns currently than the economic impact of this invasion. I know that the human impact of such an event would be so horrific, and my heart goes out to the people of Ukraine. I wasn't actually planning to make this video as I had already planned something else for this week, but the dynamics of such a global event are too great not to talk about. Life is going to be different for a lot of people, and let's be prepared. But how did we even get here? How is it possible in this 21st century for one country to simply invade the other? To understand that, we need to rewind to the past. This is a story of how the actions and dreams of one man can lead to the suffering of millions of people. We have seen this happen in the past, and now we see it again. This is a story of two neighboring countries turning into arch rivals. This is the story of Ukraine and Russia. Ukraine has always been historically, strategically, and economically important for Russia. In fact, modern-day Russia has its original roots in Kyiv, the capital city of Ukraine. These two countries were deeply connected, not just in their history and culture, but also in the economy and politics. What Putin wants today is rooted in what happened more than 3 decades ago, when this happened.
The former Soviet republics have dissolved the Soviet Union.
The Soviet Union, as a subject of international and geopolitical reality, no longer exists. So the hammer and sickle is lowered for the last time, and an era comes to an end.
All of these 15 Soviet republics that made the Soviet Union became independent, including Ukraine, and thus started Putin's problem with Ukraine. But why invade Ukraine and not any of the other 15 Soviet republics? What's so special about Ukraine that makes it a target of invasion from Russia? To understand that, we need to talk about NATO. From the time of the Second World War, there were two rival military alliances on the European continent. NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, including countries in the West, and the Warsaw Pact, with the Soviet Union and other East European countries. The Warsaw Pact came to an end in 1991 with the dissolving of the Soviet Union. But in the following 20 years, many Warsaw Pact territories aligned themselves more to the West and became members of NATO. This was worrying for Russia because of an important strategic and geographical reason: the North European plain. From the Netherlands in the west to the mountains in the east, this part of Europe is dominated by a geographic area called the North European plain. In Western Europe, the plain is comparatively narrow. But as we move further east, it broadens steadily until it reaches its greatest width in West Russia, where it extends more than 2,000 miles. This is one of the largest uninterrupted expanses of plain land on the Earth's surface, and that makes it increasingly difficult for Russia to defend across its entire length. But this wasn't much of a problem earlier for Russia, since the countries in the Warsaw Pact acted as a primary defense wall against any potential military advance. But with their inclusion in NATO, the enemy was at the front doors for Russia. The last piece in the puzzle was Ukraine, which had always remained a neutral zone. But if Ukraine became a NATO member state, it would shift the NATO front lines far across the broader section of the North European plain and into Russia. Now within this lens, you can easily see why Ukraine always will be of core interest to Moscow. Putin is a strategist, and behind all the cultural and historical reasons, he knows this strategic fact very well. Hence came his two significant demands. First, Ukraine never joined NATO, and second, NATO reverses its eastward expansion and removes its military infrastructure from member countries that joined the alliance after 1997. And Putin implied that if his demands are not met, he's gonna invade Ukraine. And that he did. And how did the world react? Sanctions.
We will limit Russia's ability to do business in dollars, euros, pounds, and yen.
We'll be imposing sanctions on President Putin
To continue imposing massive costs on Russia.
Since Ukraine is still not part of NATO, there is a limit on how far the Western countries can get directly involved in the crisis. And then the only way left is indirect one, and that is to impose economic sanctions on Russia. United States, Canada, UK, Japan and European allies have all agreed to bar major Russian financial institutions from SWIFT.
It's been called the nuclear option of sanctions. Western allies have banned several Russian banks from SWIFT in response to its invasion of Ukraine.
SWIFT, or the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication, is a platform integrated into banking systems worldwide for efficiently facilitating money transfers. And the sanctions will cut Russia off from much of the international financial system and freeze around $400 billion of Russia's central bank reserves during a war that possibly cost Russia $20 billion a day. The ripple effects of this invasion could extend well beyond Ukraine and Russia. This conflict will have tragic consequences for the world economy, and just like any other conflict, the most burden will fall on the middle and the working class.
The war in Ukraine has pushed up the price of oil to a 10-year high.
Experts say higher prices could last months or even years.
Russia is the world's third biggest petroleum producer, and this will be a direct and sudden impact since a major part of the global transport and freight movement depends on oil. The crisis has already caused the oil price to jump to its highest level in 7 years. JP Morgan has indicated that the oil prices could easily jump to $120 a barrel, and if Russian oil exports are cut in half, Brent oil prices would likely raise to $150 a barrel. To put things in perspective, the last time this happened was in the economic crisis of 2008. Oil becomes expensive means everyday life becomes expensive. Russia is also a major exporter of natural gas, and Europe receives close to 40% of its natural gas from Russia. If you live in a European country, you should expect to pay higher home utility bills for gas heating and the electricity generated from gas. Europe could somehow muddle through this winter, but if the crisis prolongs, it would struggle with the inventories for the next year. The crisis could also lead to a surge in global food prices. Russia and Ukraine are both big grain exporters. The two countries combined make up almost a third of the world's wheat exports, and the prices have soared since the start of the crisis. This could lead to physical food shortages, particularly in countries that buy from Russia and Ukraine. Outside of the price of natural gas and oil, this conflict will likely worsen something that is already affecting us badly.
Inflation, inflation, and inflation.
Inflation is too high.
Inflation rose there at the highest rate in almost 40 years.
These are not just numbers on a graph, and you don't need to know the rate of inflation to feel its heat. And a global crisis such as this one can increase the inflation rates, making everything more expensive. That could mean faster interest rate hikes to cool off inflation. The idea is that when the interest rate increases, it becomes more expensive to borrow money. And as a result, people will have less money to spend, will buy fewer things, and the prices will stop rising quickly. But a rise in interest rates could mean a surge in mortgage rates, car loans, and credit card payments. And it's just not the rate of inflation that matters, but also the people's expectation that it will rise further. This can lead to a phenomenon called wage price spiral, where people demand higher wages to compensate for the higher cost of living. This forces companies to increase prices further across the board to pay for the wage rises. And this leads back to higher prices of goods and higher living costs. It is expected that the consumer sentiment will weaken further as people become more conscious, spending less and saving more. Companies may pull back investment and hiring, damping job growth. What all that means is that a slower economic growth is on the horizon. And finally, I have to talk about the stock market. And when it comes to the market, this may be what you have been hearing in the mainstream media.
The invasion of Ukraine is sparking major volatility on Wall Street. The Dow, the S&P 500, and the Nasdaq all suffered huge losses in early trading Thursday.
If you have been following the markets for some time, you will know that we have been expecting this drop since mid of January. And the most likely candidate could be the anticipation of higher interest rates and not the invasion as such. As of now, Wall Street seems to be more worried about Fed Chairman Jay Powell than Vladimir Putin. But having said that, there will definitely be a short-term impact on the markets. Markets are by large an emotional structure and are highly influenced by the social mood of the people. When people and investors are nervous and scared, that tends to reflect in stock prices. When fear is high, investors tend to sell risky assets such as stocks and turn to less risky ones such as gold. So do expect this turbulence to put a dent in your investment portfolio in the short term. I know losing some money in the stock markets or crypto is not as trivial as losing your life, or not having enough to eat, or not being able to sleep properly at night. But I want to stress this point that the war won't change much for the rich. It's the common man living all over the world will lose his hard-earned money due to the decisions made by few people in power. But is there something you can do? Yes, there is. An excellent place to start is tightening your budget and cutting down on your expenses. And with that save money, build an emergency fund. There is no way of knowing how long this can last and how far it can escalate. And this could probably lead to a global recession in the near future. And for those who are thinking about timing the markets and making use of the drops due to the crisis, be careful. There is never a good time to time the market. It is easy to say sell the high and buy the dip. But to do this and make profits, you need to be right twice. The peak you sell and the dip you buy. And a simple probability says that it is very difficult to get both right in practice. To put more simply, don't panic or be greedy. If you are a long-term investor, try to look beyond these short-term events and try to keep that long-term perspective. As someone living in Europe, I am worried and I am monitoring the situation closely. But as an investor, I am less concerned. I am going to stay invested and dollar cost average to my current portfolio. Wars are inherently unpredictable and the actual outcome is likely to be messier than any of the predicted versions. But do remember that this is not a war created by the people of Russia. They are just like every one of us. They want to be in a job that supports the family. They want the kids to get a good education. They want to feel safe and lead a peaceful, happy life. And that's what 99% of the people in the world want. Wars are the result of the desires and greed of the 1%. And for that 1%, the rest 99% suffers. The brave and humanitarian stories coming from Ukraine and Russia are an inspiration for all. If unarmed Ukrainians can stand up against Russian tanks and Russian citizens can protest at home at great personal risk to themselves, we can all be inspired to do something. Make a donation. Voice your protest online. Welcome the refugees. Every small action counts. It's not the crisis as such. It's where we stand and the actions we take shape the future. There always comes a time when we have to stand up and be counted. And that time is here.